You're in the wrong section, sweetheart. People like you belong in the back with the rest of the help. Bradford Kane's voice cut through the first-class cabin of Phoenix Airways Flight 847 like a blade dipped in entitlement. He towered over the young black woman seated in 1A, his platinum American Express card gleaming between manicured fingers like a weapon of financial warfare. His Armani suit cost more than most people's cars, and he wore his arrogance like cologne, thick and suffocating. What he didn't know was that in exactly 8 minutes, federal agents would storm this aircraft. What he didn't know was that the help he just insulted owned every bolt, rivet, and seat on this Boeing 777. What he didn't know was that his racist comment had just triggered the most expensive mistake in aviation history. But before we dive into the storm that's about to hit 30,000 feet, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below because this story is about to go global. And if moments like this make your blood boil, if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on your bank account or the color of your skin, then hit that subscribe button, because justice is about to be served ice cold, and you're going to want to see every second of what happens next. The young woman in seat 1A didn't flinch. Maya Johnson, 24 years old, sat perfectly still in her oversized Yale hoodie, her dark eyes meeting Bradford's pale blue ones without a trace of intimidation. She wore faded leggings, beaten Nike sneakers with frayed laces, and carried a worn backpack that had seen better decades. To everyone looking at her, she appeared to be exactly what Bradford assumed, a scholarship student who had somehow lucked into a first-class seat she couldn't afford. They were all wrong. Maya Johnson was worth $3.2 billion. Exactly 72 hours ago, she had completed the acquisition of Phoenix Airways, the very airline Bradford was now demanding special treatment from. She owned the plane he was standing on, the seat he was coveting, and the company whose stock would plummet by tomorrow morning because of what was about to unfold. "Excuse me," Maya said quietly, her voice steady and measured. "I have a boarding pass for this seat. 1A, paid in full." Bradford scoffed, a wet, dismissive sound that echoed through the cabin. "Listen, honey, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm a Diamond Medallion member. I've been flying longer than you've been alive. That seat belongs to someone who actually belongs in first class." Behind him, Carmen Valdez approached with the urgent stride of someone eager to please the right kind of passenger. At 34, Carmen had been a flight attendant for 12 years, long enough to know that keeping wealthy white men happy kept her employed. As a single mother from El Salvador supporting 3 kids and her elderly mother, she couldn't afford to make the wrong choice. Unfortunately for Carmen, she was about to make the worst choice of her career. "What seems to be the problem here, Mr. Kane?" Carmen asked, her voice dripping with deference. She recognized him from the manifest, had memorized the names of all diamond-level passengers before boarding. Her tablet showed his preference: aisle seats, extra legroom, and immediate attention to any requests. "This individual," Bradford said, refusing to look at Maya directly, "is occupying my preferred seat. I specifically requested 1A for the bulkhead privacy. I have a crucial meeting with the London Financial District tomorrow, and I need the space to prepare." Carmen glanced at Maya, taking in the hoodie, the sneakers, the youth. She saw exactly what Bradford wanted her to see: someone who didn't belong. "Miss, could I see your boarding pass, please?" Maya pulled out her phone, the screen displaying her digital boarding pass. The details were clear. Maya Johnson, seat 1A, first class, Phoenix Airways, Flight 847. Carmen studied it for a long moment, her trained eye looking for any signs of fraud or manipulation. It appeared legitimate, but appearances, she had learned, could be deceiving. "Mr. Kane has diamond status," Carmen said finally, her tone shifting from professional to authoritative. "And while your boarding pass appears valid, we need to verify the payment method. There have been several instances recently of fraudulent bookings using stolen credit card information. The cabin had begun to fill with other passengers, and several had stopped their boarding process to watch the drama unfolding in row 1. Maria Santos, a marketing executive from Phoenix, quietly raised her phone and began recording. Her finger tapped the live stream button on Instagram, and within seconds, viewers began joining the feed. Jake Patterson, a tech blogger seated in 2C, opened his laptop and started typing, his Twitter feed already composing the real-time thread that would eventually reach 3 million people. He had been planning to work on a review of the new MacBook Pro during the flight, but this was infinitely more interesting. "I paid $12,000 for this seat," Maya said calmly, her voice carrying just enough volume for the growing audience to hear clearly. "I have every right to be here, and I'm not moving." Bradford stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that would have intimidated most people. 12,000? Right. And I suppose you earned that money through entirely legitimate means? The implication hung in the air like toxic smoke. Carmen felt a momentary pang of discomfort at the obvious racial undertone, but she pushed it aside. She had bills to pay, mouths to feed, and Bradford Kane probably spent more on flights in a year than she made in salary. The choice seemed obvious. "Miss Johnson," Carmen said, reading the name from the boarding pass, "I'm going to need you to come with me to verify your payment information with our ground crew. Mr. Kane, please take your preferred seat. We'll have this resolved momentarily." Maya didn't move. She looked directly at Carmen, her expression unchanged but something flickering behind her eyes that should have served as a warning. "Are you asking me to leave my assigned, paid-for seat based on his request and your assumptions about my ability to afford it?" "I'm asking you to cooperate with standard verification procedures," Carmen replied, though no such procedures actually existed. She was improvising, creating policy on the spot to appease the passenger she deemed more valuable. Bradford settled into seat 1A like a conquering king claiming his throne. He pulled out his phone and made a show of checking his messages, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Some people just don't understand their place in the world. Good thing there are professionals like you to maintain order." Other passengers were beginning to take notice. An elderly white couple in row 2 whispered to each other, the woman shaking her head in apparent disapproval. A young Hispanic man in 3A had his phone out, clearly recording. The businessman in 1B shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Bradford and Maya. Maya reached into her backpack and pulled out a second phone, this one different from the first. It was matte black, encrypted, and had no carrier markings. She held it calmly in her lap, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Carmen," Maya said, her voice still quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the ambient noise of boarding passengers. "I suggest you check your passenger manifest one more time. I suggest you verify who exactly you're trying to remove from this aircraft, and I suggest you do it very, very carefully." Bradford laughed, a harsh bark that drew stares from across the cabin. "Are you threatening the crew now?" "Carmen, I think we need security. This person is clearly becoming aggressive." Carmen hesitated for the first time. There was something about Maya's demeanor, something about the way she sat perfectly still while storm clouds gathered around her, that triggered a warning bell in the back of Carmen's mind. But Bradford Kane was a known quantity. His complaints could reach corporate offices. His dissatisfaction could cost her job. The young woman in the hoodie was a stranger, a risk she couldn't afford to take. "I'm calling for security," Carmen announced, keying her communication device. "Captain Brooks, we have a non-compliant passenger in first class refusing to cooperate with crew instructions, requesting immediate assistance." The response crackled through her earpiece within seconds. "Copy that, Carmen. Security has been notified. Handle it according to protocol." Maya's thumb moved across her encrypted phone screen. She pressed a single button, held it for 3 seconds, and then placed the device face down on her tray table. To anyone watching, it appeared to be nothing more than a young woman checking her messages. In reality, she had just activated a direct line to the Federal Aviation Administration's Emergency Response Division. In exactly 6 minutes, Captain David Brooks would receive a call that would ground not just this flight, but Bradford Cane's entire world. But first, Carmen Valdez was about to make the worst decision of her career, and Bradford Cane was about to say something that would be played on news channels across 3 continents. "You know what I love about flying first class?" Bradford announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the cabin as more passengers filed past. "It's one of the last places where standards still matter, where people who've earned their place get to enjoy it without having to deal with—" He gestured vaguely toward Maya without finishing the sentence, but his meaning was crystal clear. An uncomfortable silence fell over the first-class cabin. The couple in row 2 stopped talking entirely. The businessman in 1B buried his face in a magazine. Even Carmen looked uneasy, but she had already committed to her course of action. Maya Johnson sat in perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing even and controlled. She had been here before, not physically but emotionally. She had been the only black student in boardrooms where men like Bradford Cane decided her worth based on her appearance. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and insulted by people who couldn't imagine that someone who looked like her could own the buildings they worked in. The difference was that this time, she didn't have to prove herself. She just had to wait. Security was on their way. Federal investigators had been notified. And Bradford Cane, in his infinite arrogance, was about to provide enough recorded evidence to ensure that his racism would follow him for the rest of his life. The countdown had begun, and everyone on Flight 847 was about to discover that assumptions, especially racist ones, can cost everything. Maya Johnson's story didn't begin in a first-class cabin, and it certainly didn't begin with billions in the bank. It began 16 years ago in Beverly Hills, California, on a warm June evening that would change the trajectory of her entire life. She was 8 years old, wearing a carefully pressed thrift store dress that her grandmother had altered to fit her perfectly. The dress was navy blue with small white flowers, and Maya had felt beautiful in it. She was celebrating something momentous, her acceptance to MIT's summer program for gifted children. A scholarship that would change everything for a girl from Compton whose mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Maya's mother, Jennifer Johnson, had saved for 3 months to afford dinner at Chez Laurent, an upscale French restaurant in Beverly Hills. It wasn't about the food, though Jennifer knew the prices would strain their budget for weeks. It was about showing Maya that she belonged anywhere her mind could take her. It was about celebrating achievement in a place that represented the success Maya was working toward. They walked through the glass doors holding hands, Maya's excitement bubbling over as she talked about the robotics projects she would work on at MIT. The hostess, a thin white woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and cold blue eyes, looked them up and down with barely concealed disgust. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness, "but we don't have any availability tonight." Jennifer glanced around the restaurant. At least half the tables were empty, and she could see several couples being seated without reservations. "Are you sure? It's a special occasion for my daughter, and we saved up specifically to eat here tonight." The hostess's smile became even more artificial. "I'm quite sure. Perhaps you would be more comfortable at the Denny's down the street. They're more accommodating to families like yours." The words hit 8-year-old Maya like a physical blow. She didn't fully understand the racial implications, but she understood rejection. She understood that this woman was telling them they didn't belong based on nothing more than how they looked. She watched her mother's face crumple slightly before Jennifer composed herself, taking Maya's hand and walking toward the door with as much dignity as she could muster. That night, as Maya cried herself to sleep, she made a promise that would drive every decision for the next 16 years. She would never again be in a position where someone could tell her she didn't belong. She would own the restaurants, the airlines, the businesses that tried to exclude people like her. She would make sure no child ever had to feel the humiliation she felt that night. The promise carried her through MIT, where she graduated at 18 with degrees in computer science and business. It drove her through the venture capital world, where she was often the only black woman in rooms full of middle-aged white men who spoke to her like she was their secretary until they realized she was their boss. By 24, she had built a technology empire focused specifically on acquiring companies with histories of discrimination, transforming their cultures, and proving that diversity wasn't just morally right, it was profitable. Phoenix Airways had been on her target list for 8 months. The airline had faced dozens of discrimination complaints over the past 5 years, complaints that were quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements and never reached public attention. Passengers complained of being moved from first class to coach without explanation, of being subjected to additional security screening, of being treated with suspicion and hostility by crew members who saw their skin color before they saw their boarding passes. The acquisition had been complex and secretive. Maya worked through 3 shell companies and a team of international lawyers to purchase the airline's debt when it became distressed during the pandemic. Phoenix Airways management had no idea who was buying their company until the papers were signed and the money transferred. By the time they realized Maya Johnson owned controlling interest in their airline, it was too late to do anything about it. Maya had planned to announce the acquisition on Monday morning with a comprehensive reform plan that would reshape how the airline treated all passengers. She had developed new training programs, diversity initiatives, and accountability measures that would serve as a model for the entire industry. The plan was detailed, thoughtful, and designed to change aviation culture from the inside out. What she hadn't planned was flying incognito on her own airline to assess the current culture firsthand. What she hadn't expected was to become the victim of the very discrimination she was purchasing the company to eliminate. What she absolutely hadn't anticipated was Bradford Kane. Bradford Kane represented everything Maya had spent her career fighting against. At 52, he was third-generation wealth built on Manhattan real estate and Wall Street connections. His grandfather had made millions developing housing that explicitly excluded minorities through restrictive covenants. His father had continued the tradition with luxury apartment buildings and exclusive clubs that maintained their whiteness through cultural fit requirements and subjective application processes. Bradford himself had inherited not just money, but the worldview that came with it. He genuinely believed that his success was evidence of his superiority, that his wealth was proof of his worthiness. He saw people like Maya as affirmative action beneficiaries who had been given opportunities they hadn't earned. The possibility that a young black woman could have legitimately earned more than him was literally inconceivable. His travel patterns reflected his privilege. Bradford flew first class exclusively, stayed in 5-star hotels, and expected immediate deference from anyone he perceived as service staff. He had diamond medallion status with 4 different airlines, not because he was a frequent traveler, but because his assistant booked him expensive flights rather than economical ones. Money, in Bradford's world, was meant to buy superiority, not just comfort. More importantly, Bradford had a documented history of racist incidents that his lawyers and family wealth had kept quiet. 3 years earlier, he had filed a complaint against a black pilot, claiming the man didn't look professional enough to fly the plane. 2 years ago, he had demanded a different server at an upscale restaurant, telling the manager that he preferred to be served by people who speak proper English. 6 months ago, he had loudly complained when a young Latina woman sat next to him in first class, suggesting she must have stolen the ticket. Each incident had been handled quietly. Settlements were paid, non-disclosure agreements were signed, and Bradford continued living without consequences for his behavior. He had never faced real accountability because his money had always been able to make problems disappear. Today, however, his money would prove insufficient. Carmen Valdez represented a different kind of tragedy. At 34, she was a single mother supporting 3 children under 10 and her elderly mother who required expensive medical care. Carmen had emigrated from El Salvador when she was 16, working her way through community college while cleaning offices at night. Becoming a flight attendant had been a dream job for someone with limited options: decent pay, health benefits, and the possibility of seeing the world. But 12 years in the industry had taught Carmen harsh lessons about survival. Airlines rewarded crew members who kept high-value passengers happy and punished those who created complications. She had seen colleagues fired for refusing to bend rules for VIP passengers, and she had watched others get promoted for going above and beyond to accommodate demanding travelers. Carmen's situation was particularly precarious because she was supporting so many people on a single income. Her mother's diabetes medication cost $800 per month, even with insurance. Her youngest daughter needed speech therapy that the health plan only partially covered. Carmen couldn't afford to lose her job, and she couldn't afford to make enemies of passengers who had the power to complain to corporate headquarters. Her decision to side with Bradford Kane wasn't born of personal racism, but of economic desperation. She genuinely believed that keeping a Diamond Medallion member happy was more important than protecting the dignity of a passenger she assumed had no recourse. She calculated that Bradford's complaint could cost her job, while the young woman in the hoodie could be safely ignored. Carmen's calculation was about to prove catastrophically wrong. Captain David Brooks, 45 years old, represented the third point of this triangle of assumptions and biases. A former Air Force pilot with an exemplary record, David prided himself on running a professional operation. He trusted his crew's judgment implicitly and rarely interfered with cabin management decisions unless safety was involved. David's military background had instilled in him a respect for hierarchy and protocol that served him well in most situations. When Carmen reported a non-compliant passenger, he assumed she had followed standard procedures and made appropriate assessments. He had worked with Carmen for 6 years and trusted her judgment. The idea that she might be acting on racial bias rather than legitimate safety concerns never occurred to him. His response to Carmen's call for security assistance was automatic and unquestioning. A veteran crew member was reporting a problem passenger who refused to follow instructions. Standard protocol was to support the crew and resolve the situation quickly to avoid delays. David approved the security response without investigating the details personally. He was about to learn why assumptions, even well-intentioned ones, could destroy careers and lives. As these 3 individuals, Maya with her hidden billions and determination for justice, Bradford with his inherited racism and sense of entitlement, and Carmen with her economic desperation and misplaced priorities, moved toward a collision that would change aviation history, none of them fully understood what was about to unfold. Maya knew she had the power to destroy careers and transform industries, but she hoped it wouldn't be necessary. She wanted to believe that reason and dignity might prevail. Bradford believed his money and status made him untouchable, that his comfort mattered more than anyone else's rights. Carmen believed she was making a smart career move by prioritizing the passenger she thought mattered most. All of them were about to discover how wrong they could be. The encrypted phone on Maya's tray table showed a single flashing light, indicating her message had been received by federal authorities. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., FAA emergency response protocols were being activated. Federal agents were being dispatched. Investigation teams were being assembled, but Bradford Kane was just getting started with his racist commentary, and Carmen Valdez was about to escalate the situation beyond any possibility of quiet resolution. The next few minutes would determine whether this remained a simple passenger dispute or became a federal civil rights case that would dominate news cycles for months. Maya Johnson sat perfectly still and waited for her would-be tormentors to seal their own fate. The passenger door closed with a hydraulic hiss that signaled the beginning of the end for Bradford Kane and Carmen Valdez, though neither of them realized it yet. The Boeing 707 was now sealed, containing within its aluminum walls what would become the most documented case of airline discrimination in aviation history. Maria Santos, still live streaming from Seat 3B, watched her viewer count climb past 15,000. Her Instagram followers were reposting the stream across platforms, adding commentary that ranged from outraged to amazed. The hashtag #Flight847 had already started trending organically, even though most people had no idea what they were about to witness. "You know what frustrates me most about situations like this?" Bradford Kane announced to the cabin, his voice carrying that particular tone wealthy men use when they want everyone to hear their opinions. "We have standards for a reason. First class isn't just about money, it's about belonging. It's about people who understand certain expectations." Jake Patterson's fingers flew across his laptop keyboard, live tweeting the incident with the kind of real-time commentary that makes ordinary moments viral. His follower count was modest, but several verified accounts had already begun retweeting his thread. The reach was expanding exponentially. Carmen returned from the galley area where she had been coordinating with the flight crew. Her face was flushed with what might have been excitement or anxiety. She approached Maya's seat with the purposeful stride of someone who believed she held all the cards. "Miss Johnson," Carmen said, her voice now carrying official authority, "I've spoken with our gate manager, and we have a situation. Your booking has been flagged for verification. I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me to resolve this matter before takeoff." Maya didn't move. Her hands remained folded calmly in her lap, her breathing steady and controlled. "What specific verification is required? I've shown you my boarding pass, which clearly displays my assigned seat. What additional documentation do you need?" "Payment verification," Carmen replied, though she knew this wasn't a real procedure. Credit card fraud is a serious issue in the airline industry, and certain profiles require additional screening. The word profiles hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everyone involved. Maya's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that suggested steel beneath the casual exterior. "Profiles?" Maya repeated softly. "Based on what criteria?" Bradford Kane interjected before Carmen could respond. "Oh, come on. Everyone knows what she means. Look around, sweetheart. Do you see anyone else in this cabin who looks like they're wearing their older brother's hand-me-downs? This isn't a Greyhound bus." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to pause. Several passengers audibly gasped. The elderly woman in 2A whispered, "Dear Lord," under her breath. The businessman in 1B finally looked up from his magazine, his face pale with second-hand embarrassment. Maria Santos's viewer count jumped to 25,000 as her followers shared the stream with increasingly frantic commentary. The phrases, "Did he just say that?" and "This is insane," started appearing in dozens of languages as the stream reached international audiences. Maya's voice remained steady when she spoke. "Mr. Kane, I want to make sure I understand you correctly. Are you suggesting that my appearance disqualifies me from sitting in a seat I purchased?" "I'm suggesting," Bradford said, leaning forward in what was still technically Maya's assigned seat, "that some people need to learn their place in the world. And your place isn't here, disrupting the travel experience of paying passengers." Carmen felt a chill of recognition that this conversation had moved beyond passenger services into dangerous territory, but she had already committed to supporting Bradford. Backing down now would look weak and might anger the passenger she couldn't afford to upset. "Miss Johnson," Carmen said, "I'm asking you one final time to cooperate with our security verification process. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to treat this as a disruptive passenger situation." Maya reached for her encrypted phone and pressed another sequence of buttons. "Carmen, I'm going to ask you to state clearly, for the record, why you're asking me to leave my assigned seat while allowing Mr. Kane to remain in his. Mr. Kane has diamond status and I have a valid boarding pass and a paid ticket, Maya interrupted. What's the difference? Carmen glanced at Bradford, seeking support, and found him nodding encouragingly. She had gone too far to retreat now. The difference is that Mr. Kane's profile doesn't trigger our security protocols. What about my profile triggers these protocols? Maya pressed. Carmen's training had never prepared her for this direct questioning. She fell back on corporate language that revealed more than it concealed. Certain demographic indicators combined with unusual booking patterns require additional verification. Demographic indicators, Maya repeated. Please specify. Bradford Kane, apparently feeling that Carmen needed assistance, decided to clarify things himself. Look, nobody wants to say it directly, but we all know what's happening here. Young black girl, expensive ticket, no obvious means of payment. It doesn't add up. You probably got this ticket through some kind of affirmative action program or you're using a stolen credit card. Either way, you don't belong here, and everyone knows it. The cabin erupted. Passengers began talking over each other, some expressing shock, others arguing with Bradford directly. The Hispanic man in 3A stood up, his phone camera focused directly on Bradford's face. Did everyone hear that? Maria Santos's live stream exploded to over 50,000 viewers as people shared the link with increasingly urgent messages. Flight 847 began trending nationally as clips of Bradford's comments spread across TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram simultaneously. Maya Johnson sat in perfect stillness at the center of the storm. When she spoke, her voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Mr. Kane, I want to make absolutely certain I understand your position. You believe that black passengers in first class must be using stolen credit cards or receiving unearned benefits. Is that an accurate summary of your statement? Bradford, energized by what he perceived as support from Carmen and emboldened by his own sense of superiority, doubled down. I believe that people should earn their way into places like this instead of taking handouts or engaging in fraud. I believe that standards exist for a reason, and I believe that some people like you, are destroying the quality of air travel by gaming the system. People like me, Maya said. Please clarify what you mean by that phrase. You know exactly what I mean. I want to hear you say it clearly. Bradford Kane looked around the cabin, seeming to register for the first time that multiple cameras were recording his words. But he had gone too far to back down, and his ego wouldn't allow retreat. Fine. Black passengers who clearly can't afford first-class tickets, but somehow end up in first-class seats. Happy? It's obvious fraud, and everyone knows it, but nobody has the courage to say it anymore because of political correctness. Carmen Valdez realized in that moment that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The conversation had moved far beyond passenger services into territory that would certainly trigger corporate investigations and potentially legal action. But she had already aligned herself with Bradford's position, and reversing course would make her look weak and indecisive. Security will be boarding shortly, Carmen announced, her voice shakier than before. Miss Johnson, this is your final opportunity to resolve this voluntarily. Maya pulled out her regular phone and began typing. To observers, it appeared she was texting friends or posting to social media like any young person in crisis might do. In reality, she was composing a detailed message to her legal team, her public relations firm, and her executive assistant. The message was brief but comprehensive. Discrimination incident in progress. Full documentation available. Initiate federal response protocol. Prepare for full media engagement. 2 Port Authority police officers approached the aircraft, their expressions suggesting they viewed this as a routine passenger removal. Officer Ryan Mitchell, a 15-year veteran with a generally professional reputation, had handled dozens of these situations. In his experience, passenger disputes usually involved drunk travelers, mental health episodes, or occasional scammers trying to use fraudulent documents. The call from Phoenix Airways crew had described an uncooperative passenger refusing to follow crew instructions and possibly using fraudulent payment methods. The officers expected to escort someone off the plane, complete some paperwork, and move on to their next call. They had no idea they were walking into a federal civil rights incident that would be analyzed in law schools for decades. Officer Mitchell boarded the aircraft first, his body camera automatically recording everything. He was followed by Officer James Rodriguez, a younger cop who specialized in de-escalation techniques. Both men immediately noticed the tension in the first-class cabin and the number of passengers who were openly filming with their phones. Carmen met them near the galley, her voice low and urgent. "Officers, we have a passenger in 1A who's refusing to cooperate with our verification procedures. She's become increasingly argumentative and is disrupting other passengers." Officer Mitchell glanced toward Maya, noting her calm posture and the fact that she appeared to be quietly sitting in her seat rather than causing any visible disruption. "What kind of verification procedures?" "Payment verification. Her booking was flagged for possible fraud, and she's refusing to provide additional documentation." Bradford Kane stood up from seat 1A, apparently feeling that his expertise was needed. "Officers, I appreciate you responding quickly. This individual has been harassing crew members and making other passengers uncomfortable." "She's clearly using a stolen credit card or some kind of fraudulent documentation to access first class." Officer Rodriguez studied the situation, noting the obvious tension, but also the disparity between the described behavior and what he was observing. "Ma'am," he said to Maya, "can you show us your boarding pass and identification?" Maya handed over both documents without speaking. Officer Mitchell examined them carefully, noting that they appeared completely legitimate. "These look fine to me. What's the specific concern?" Carmen felt the situation slipping away from her and grasped for justification. "Standard protocol requires additional verification for certain high-risk bookings. She fits the profile for fraudulent transactions." "What profile?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Bradford Kane, apparently sensing that the officers needed additional convincing, stepped forward. "Officers, look at her. Does she look like someone who can afford a $12,000 ticket? Use your common sense. She's probably stealing from honest passengers, and this airline is too politically correct to call it what it is." Officer Mitchell's body camera captured every word, including Bradford's obvious racial implications. The veteran cop began to understand that this situation was more complex than a simple passenger dispute. "Sir," he said to Bradford, "I'm going to need you to step back and let us handle this." "I'm just trying to help you understand what you're dealing with," Bradford replied. "These people always claim discrimination when they get caught doing something illegal. Don't fall for the guilt trip." Maya Johnson finally stood up. The movement was fluid and controlled, but it commanded instant attention from everyone in the cabin. She faced Officer Mitchell directly, her voice clear and steady. "Officer, I want to state clearly for your body camera and for all these witnesses that I am being removed from my paid seat based solely on racial profiling by both this crew member and this passenger. I have provided all requested documentation. I have not raised my voice or been disruptive in any way, and I am being discriminated against based on the assumption that black passengers cannot afford first-class tickets." She paused, letting the statement sink in, then continued. "I am requesting your badge numbers. I am requesting that this incident be properly documented, and I am informing you that federal authorities have been notified of this civil rights violation." The words "federal authorities" hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Carmen's face went white. Bradford's expression shifted from smugness to concern for the first time. Officer Mitchell exchanged glances with his partner, both men suddenly realizing they might be dealing with something far more serious than a routine passenger removal. Maya's encrypted phone buzzed once, a soft sound that only she could hear. The message was brief. Federal response team en route. ETA 4 minutes. Maintain position. The countdown Bradford Kane didn't know existed had just reached 0. In exactly 4 minutes, federal agents would board this aircraft, and everyone who had participated in discriminating against Maya Johnson would face consequences they couldn't begin to imagine. But Bradford Kane had one more racist comment to make, and Carmen Valdez had one more terrible decision to make, and both of those choices would ensure that their names would be remembered long after Flight 847 returned to the gate. Officer Rodriguez's radio crackled to life with an urgency that cut through the tense atmosphere of the first-class cabin. All units, Federal Response Team arriving at Gate B7. Secure aircraft pending arrival of federal investigators. No departures until cleared. The blood drained from Carmen's face. Bradford Kane, who had been gesturing dismissively at Maya, froze mid-motion. Captain David Brooks's voice came through the cabin intercom with barely concealed confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay due to air traffic control requirements. We'll have more information shortly." Maya Johnson remained perfectly calm, though a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. She had been counting down the minutes, and federal response time had been exactly what she expected. Officer Mitchell keyed his radio to respond to dispatch, but before he could speak, his body camera captured Bradford Kane making what would become the most expensive statement of his life. "Federal investigators? For what? This is absolutely ridiculous." Bradford's voice rose with indignation and growing panic. "I'm a tax-paying American citizen, and I shouldn't have to deal with federal bureaucracy because some welfare recipient is playing the race card to get attention." The phrase welfare recipient echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Maria Santos's live stream, now approaching 100,000 viewers, captured every word. Jake Patterson's Twitter thread had been retweeted by verified accounts, including several news organizations and civil rights groups. The story was becoming national news in real time. Maya turned to face Bradford directly, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Kane, you have now accused me of credit card fraud, welfare fraud, and using affirmative action illegitimately. You've stated that black passengers don't belong in first class and suggested that I'm engaged in criminal activity. Is that a complete summary of your allegations?" Bradford, apparently realizing that his words were being recorded by multiple sources, attempted to backtrack. "I never said. That's not what I meant. I'm just saying that this whole situation has been blown out of proportion. Everyone's being too sensitive about obvious inconsistencies." "What inconsistencies?" Maya pressed. Carmen Valdez made her final, fatal decision in that moment. Seeing Bradford struggle and fearing that her own position would be undermined if she didn't maintain her support for his complaints, she decided to escalate rather than retreat. "Miss Johnson," Carmen said, her voice carrying official authority, "you're creating a disturbance that's affecting the safety and comfort of other passengers. I'm ordering you to leave this aircraft immediately, or these officers will remove you forcibly." The words forcibly sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Several passengers stood up, including an elderly black man in seat 4A who pulled out his phone to join the documentation effort. A young Latina woman in 3C began streaming live on TikTok, her Spanish commentary providing real-time translation for viewers across Latin America. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction events were taking. "Ma'am, before we proceed with any removal, I need to understand the specific justification. What law or regulation has she violated?" Carmen grasped for legal authority she didn't possess. Federal aviation regulations give crew members authority to remove passengers who pose a safety risk or disrupt flight operations. She's been argumentative and non-compliant since boarding. Maya's voice cut through Carmen's explanation like steel. "Officer Mitchell, I want you to review your body camera footage. At what point have I raised my voice, used profane language, or engaged in any disruptive behavior? What specific actions have I taken that could be construed as safety risks? Officer Rodriguez consulted his notes, realizing that every interaction had been initiated by either Bradford Kane or Carmen Valdez, and that Maya had responded with consistent calm and cooperation. "Ma'am, from what I've observed, you've been seated quietly and responding to questions. I don't see disruptive behavior." Bradford Kane, sensing that the officers weren't fully supporting Carmen's position, decided to take matters into his own hands. He stood up and moved toward Maya in a way that invaded her personal space, his finger pointing directly at her face. "Look, enough is enough. I don't care what kind of victim narrative you're trying to spin here. I've been flying first class for 30 years. I spend more money with this airline than you'll make in your entire life. And I'm not going to be lectured by some diversity hire who thinks she can intimidate people into giving her things she hasn't earned." The phrase diversity hire detonated like a bomb in the confined space of the aircraft cabin. Even passengers who had been trying to remain neutral gasped audibly. Officer Mitchell moved to position himself between Bradford and Maya, his training kicking in as he recognized escalating aggressive behavior. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat and lower your voice," Officer Mitchell commanded. Bradford whirled on him with the entitled fury of someone who had never been told no by law enforcement. "Don't you tell me what to do. I know my rights, and I know exactly what this is. She's scamming the system. You're all too politically correct to call it what it is. And now federal resources are being wasted because nobody has the backbone to deal with obvious fraud." Maya Johnson stood up slowly, her movement causing the entire cabin to fall silent. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that seemed to fill every corner of the aircraft. "Mr. Kane, you've made your position clear. Carmen, you've made your decision to support his allegations rather than following actual company policy. Officers, you've documented everything." She paused, reaching into her carry-on bag. "Now, let me clarify exactly who you've been discriminating against." She pulled out a leather portfolio, the kind carried by executives in boardrooms around the world. From it, she extracted a series of documents: corporate identification, federal certifications, and a letter of authorization bearing multiple official seals. "My name is Maya Johnson," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the cabin and to the thousands of people watching via livestream. "I am the founder and CEO of Johnson Ventures, a private equity firm with assets under management exceeding $15 billion. As of 72 hours ago, I am the majority owner of Phoenix Airways." The silence that followed was absolute. Bradford Kane's mouth opened and closed without sound. Carmen Valdez staggered backward as if physically struck. Even the passengers stopped murmuring, the weight of the revelation settling over the cabin like concrete. Maya continued, her voice calm but implacable. "This aircraft, this route, this airline, I own controlling interest in all of it. The company whose standards Mr. Kane claims to represent, I make those standards. The crew member who decided my appearance disqualified me from sitting in my own aircraft, she works for me." She turned to Officer Mitchell, handing him the corporate documentation. "Officer, you're looking at federal corporate identification confirming my ownership position. The federal authorities who were notified aren't investigating passenger fraud. They're investigating civil rights violations committed against the owner of this airline by her own employees and passengers." Officer Mitchell examined the documents with growing amazement and horror. Every seal, every signature, every piece of identification was legitimate. Maya Johnson wasn't just wealthy. She was the owner of the very airline that had just discriminated against her. Bradford Kane found his voice, though it came out as a whisper. That's impossible. You can't be." "A what, Mr. Kane?" Maya asked softly. "Finish your sentence." What exactly can't I be? Bradford's face cycled through pale, red, and pale again as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami. Every racist assumption he had made, every discriminatory comment he had voiced, every moment of his behavior had been captured on video and witnessed by federal agents. He had just called the owner of the airline a welfare fraud and a diversity hire while demanding she be forcibly removed from her own aircraft. Carmen Valdez was experiencing her own moment of horrific clarity. She had not just discriminated against a passenger, she had discriminated against her ultimate boss. Every decision she had made in the past hour, every word she had spoken, every action she had taken was documented evidence of her willingness to engage in racial profiling when she thought it would benefit her career. The aircraft door opened with a mechanical hiss, and 4 federal agents in dark suits boarded the plane. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had handled civil rights investigations before, but even they seemed momentarily taken aback by the scene that greeted them. Agent Sarah Williams, the lead investigator, approached Maya first. "Ms. Johnson?" "I'm Agent Williams, Federal Aviation Administration Civil Rights Division. We received your emergency report regarding discrimination incidents on this aircraft." "Agent Williams," Maya replied, her voice professional and controlled. "Thank you for responding so quickly. As you can see, the situation has escalated beyond simple passenger bias into documented civil rights violations by both crew members and passengers." Agent Williams surveyed the cabin, noting the multiple recording devices, the obvious tension, and the clear delineation between Maya and those who had been opposing her. "We'll need to interview all parties involved and collect all available evidence. This aircraft is now considered a federal investigation site." Bradford Kane, apparently believing that his wealth and connections might still protect him, stepped forward. "Agent Williams, I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. I'm Bradford Kane of Kane Properties. Perhaps we could discuss this privately and resolve any confusion without unnecessary publicity." Agent Williams's expression didn't change. "Mr. Kane, based on preliminary reports and the evidence we're already seeing, this matter is well beyond private resolution. You're being recorded making racially discriminatory statements about a passenger's right to travel based on her appearance and your assumptions about her economic status." A second agent approached Carmen, his notebook already open. "Ms. Valdez, we'll need a complete statement regarding your decision-making process in this incident. Specifically, we need to understand why you attempted to remove a passenger from her assigned seat based on what you've called demographic indicators and profiling protocols that don't appear to exist in your company's actual policies." Carmen's voice shook as she responded. "I was trying to accommodate a high-value passenger. I made a mistake in judgment. A mistake in judgment," Maya repeated softly. "Carmen, you didn't make a mistake in judgment. You made a choice to prioritize a white passenger's baseless complaints over a black passenger's rights, and you created false justifications for that choice. You assumed I couldn't afford my ticket because of how I looked, and you decided my dignity was less important than his comfort." Maya turned to address the entire cabin, her voice carrying clearly to passengers and live stream viewers alike. "Everyone here has witnessed something important today. You've seen how discrimination works in real time, not through overt hostility, but through assumptions, through choices about whose complaints matter more, through decisions about who deserves dignity and who doesn't." She gestured toward Bradford Kane, who stood in humiliated silence. "Mr. Kane believes his wealth gives him the right to dehumanize others. He called me welfare fraud, suggested I was engaged in criminal activity, and demanded I be removed from a seat I own because he couldn't imagine that someone who looks like me could belong in first class." Her gaze shifted to Carmen. Carmen chose to support his assumptions rather than follow actual policies because she calculated that his satisfaction was more valuable than my rights. She created fake procedures and false justifications because discrimination, when it's dressed up in corporate language, can look like professionalism. Maya's voice rose slightly, carrying the weight of not just personal experience but generational struggle. This is why representation matters. This is why ownership matters. This is why we can't rely on others to protect our dignity. We have to build the power to protect it ourselves. The cabin had become a cathedral of silence, broken only by the soft sounds of recording devices and the distant hum of aircraft engines. Even Agent Williams seemed moved by the gravity of Maya's words and the historical significance of what had just transpired. Bradford Kane made one last attempt to salvage his position, his voice desperate and pleading. "Ms. Johnson, surely we can resolve this like business people. I obviously made some unfortunate comments in the heat of the moment. Perhaps we could discuss compensation for any misunderstanding." Maya's response was immediate and final. "Mr. Kane, you didn't misunderstand anything. You revealed exactly who you are. And compensation?" She smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "You're about to discover what discrimination costs when it's directed at someone who owns the building." Agent Williams closed her notebook and looked around the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this aircraft will remain grounded pending completion of our investigation. All passengers will be interviewed as witnesses, and all recorded evidence will be collected as part of the federal case file." She turned to Maya with professional respect. "Ms. Johnson, would you prefer to complete your interview here or at our field office?" "Here is fine," Maya replied. "I want everyone to understand exactly what happened today and exactly what the consequences will be." As federal agents began the formal interview process, Bradford Kane and Carmen Valdez sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that their assumptions about power, privilege, and consequences had been catastrophically wrong. Maya Johnson had not just reclaimed her seat. She had demonstrated that true power lies not in demanding respect, but in having the authority to ensure it. The federal investigation moved with the precision of a machine designed to dismantle discrimination piece by piece. Agent Williams and her team set up interview stations throughout the aircraft, turning Flight 847 into a mobile courthouse where justice moved faster than the plane had ever intended to fly. Bradford Kane's world began collapsing in real time, measured in social media notifications and canceled business relationships. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from his lawyers, his business partners, and his country club friends who were watching their own reputations threatened by association with him. The hashtag #BradfordKaneRacist was trending globally, with video clips of his comments being shared in dozens of languages. Within the first hour of the federal investigation, Kane Properties lost 3 major contracts. His business partners received recordings of Bradford's comments along with screenshots of the trending social media coverage. The Manhattan Elite Country Club, where Bradford had been a member for 15 years, received over 10,000 messages demanding his immediate expulsion. His alma mater, Princeton University, began quietly removing his name from donor recognition materials. The speed of his social and economic destruction was breathtaking. Bradford had spent 52 years building a reputation and a network based on inherited wealth and cultivated connections. Maya's recording devices and the federal investigation had destroyed both in less time than it takes to board an aircraft. Agent Williams approached Bradford for his formal interview, her expression professionally neutral despite the severity of the charges being contemplated. "Mr. Kane, you're not under arrest at this time, but you should understand that your statements today are being investigated as potential federal civil rights violations. You have the right to have an attorney present for this interview." Bradford, still struggling to comprehend the magnitude of his situation, waved off the suggestion. "I don't need a lawyer. This is all a massive overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. I was just expressing frustration with airline policies that don't make sense." Agent Williams consulted her notes, which contained direct transcripts of Bradford's recorded statements. "Mr. Kane, you stated that black passengers in first class must be using stolen credit cards or receiving unearned benefits. You called Ms. Johnson a welfare recipient, a diversity hire, and suggested she was engaged in fraud. How do you characterize these statements as policy criticism? The weight of his words, played back in the stark environment of a federal investigation, hit Bradford with devastating clarity. He had been so accustomed to expressing racist views in environments where they were tolerated or even encouraged that he had forgotten those same views could be criminal when applied to federal civil rights protections in interstate commerce. "I was frustrated," he said weakly. "I didn't mean anything personal against Ms. Johnson specifically. I was just commenting on patterns I've observed in air travel." "Patterns," Agent Williams repeated. "You've observed patterns suggesting that black passengers in first class are typically engaged in fraud?" Bradford's lawyer arrived at that moment, having broken traffic laws to reach JFK International Airport. James Morrison had represented Bradford through previous discrimination settlements, always managing to resolve matters quietly through financial arrangements and non-disclosure agreements. He entered the aircraft expecting another routine damage control operation. Instead, he found his client being interviewed by federal agents while surrounded by witnesses, recording devices, and an audience of thousands watching through live streams. Everything he usually did to protect Bradford required privacy and silence, both of which were impossible under current circumstances. "Agent Williams," Morrison interrupted, "I'm Mr. Kane's attorney. I need to confer with my client before this interview continues." "Of course," Agent Williams replied professionally. "Mr. Kane, you're free to consult with your counsel." Morrison pulled Bradford to the rear of the aircraft, his voice low and urgent. "Bradford, what the hell happened here? I'm watching video of you making explicitly racist statements to the owner of the airline. Please tell me there's some context I'm missing." Bradford's face was pale and drawn. "James, I didn't know who she was. She looked like... anyone would have assumed. This is entrapment." "She was dressed like a college student." Morrison closed his eyes, recognizing the hopelessness of Bradford's position. "Bradford, her clothing is irrelevant. You made racially discriminatory statements about her right to travel based on her appearance. Those statements were recorded by multiple sources and witnessed by federal agents. This isn't a civil settlement situation. This is a federal civil rights case." Meanwhile, Carmen Valdez was experiencing her own reckoning. Agent Rodriguez, assigned to interview flight crew, had been examining Phoenix Airways' policies and procedures, searching for any legitimate basis for Carmen's actions. "Ms. Valdez," Agent Rodriguez said, "I've reviewed your company's passenger service manual, crew training materials, and federal aviation regulations. I cannot find any policy that authorizes crew members to remove passengers based on demographic indicators or profiling protocols. Can you explain the source of your authority to demand additional verification from Ms. Johnson?" Carmen's voice shook as she responded. "It was my professional judgment based on my experience. High-value tickets purchased by certain demographics sometimes indicate fraud." "Certain demographics," Agent Rodriguez repeated. "Please specify." Carmen realized that any answer she gave would either admit to racial profiling or reveal her complete fabrication of airline policies. She had walked into a trap of her own making, caught between admitting intentional discrimination or professional incompetence. Young passengers with expensive tickets who don't seem like typical first-class travelers, she said finally. Agent Rodriguez made notes that Carmen suspected would end her aviation career forever. "Ms. Valdez, don't present as typical is not a legitimate basis for passenger removal under any federal aviation regulation or company policy. You created false procedures to justify removing a passenger based on her race and appearance." Carmen's phone had been buzzing continuously with calls from Phoenix Airways management, who were watching their company become the center of a federal civil rights investigation broadcast live across social media. The airline's stock price had dropped 15% in the past 2 hours as investors recognized the potential legal and public relations catastrophe unfolding. Phoenix Airways CEO Michael Roberts was already on his way to JFK, along with the company's legal team and crisis management consultants. The airline faced not only federal investigation, but potential lawsuits, regulatory sanctions, and permanent damage to their reputation. Carmen's actions, taken without authorization and against actual company policy, had exposed Phoenix Airways to liability that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars. Officer Mitchell completed his report with the uncomfortable awareness that his body camera had documented his own near participation in a civil rights violation. His supervisor had already contacted him to discuss the incident, and Internal Affairs was reviewing the footage to determine whether additional training or discipline was warranted. The investigation revealed that Officer Mitchell had performed appropriately once he understood the situation. But his initial readiness to remove Maya without investigating the underlying claims raised questions about unconscious bias training for airport security personnel. Captain David Brooks faced his own professional reckoning. Federal aviation investigators were reviewing his decision to approve security assistance without personally verifying the crew's allegations. While Brooks had acted according to standard protocols, the incident highlighted gaps in pilot training regarding crew bias and passenger rights. The pilots' union issued a statement supporting additional training while emphasizing that Brooks had followed existing procedures. However, Phoenix Airways suspended him pending completion of the investigation, and his commercial pilot career faced uncertainty despite his previously exemplary record. Media coverage exploded across every platform simultaneously. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and BBC all interrupted regular programming to cover the story. The incident had every element that drives modern news cycles: clear video evidence, obvious injustice, dramatic reversal, and broader social implications about racism and corporate accountability. Maya Johnson's business acumen became a secondary story that fascinated financial media. Business Insider published a timeline of her acquisition strategy, revealing the sophisticated planning that had allowed her to purchase Phoenix Airways while remaining anonymous until the moment of maximum impact. Forbes updated Maya's net worth in real time as Phoenix Airways' stock recovery began, driven by investor confidence in her reform plans and the positive publicity generated by her handling of discrimination. The same incident that destroyed Bradford Kane's reputation enhanced Maya's profile as a transformational business leader. Social media analysis showed the hashtag #Flight847 reaching over 50 million impressions within 6 hours. The incident was being discussed in multiple languages across every major platform, with video clips generating millions of views and thousands of supportive comments. The broader conversation expanded beyond this specific incident to address structural racism in travel, corporate accountability, and the power of social media to document and expose discrimination in real time. Bradford Kane's business empire continued its collapse throughout the afternoon. Kane Properties' board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted to remove Bradford from all operational roles. His real estate portfolio, heavily dependent on relationships with financial institutions and development partners, faced immediate disruption as companies severed ties to protect their own reputations. His personal life disintegrated with equal speed. The Manhattan Elite Country Club voted for immediate expulsion. His luxury hotel memberships were canceled. His children, both adults with their own professional careers, released a statement distancing themselves from their father's comments and expressing support for civil rights and equality. Most devastating was the financial impact. Bradford's wealth was largely tied up in real estate ventures and investment partnerships that required ongoing cooperation with financial institutions. As major banks and investment firms moved to protect themselves from association with documented racism, Bradford's access to capital markets evaporated. Carmen Valdez received her termination notice while still being interviewed by federal agents. Phoenix Airways Human Resources Department, working with legal counsel, moved to immediately distance the company from her actions by demonstrating swift accountability. The termination letter specified that Carmen had acted outside company policy, created false procedures, and engaged in discriminatory behavior that violated federal law and airline regulations. Her flight attendant certification faced review by the FAA, and the Flight Attendants Union declined to provide representation after reviewing the documented evidence of deliberate discrimination. Carmen's financial situation became desperate almost immediately. As a single mother with limited savings and specialized job skills that required federal certification, her employment prospects in aviation were eliminated. Her discriminatory actions had been documented so extensively that background checks for any customer service position would likely reveal the incident. The broader consequences rippled through the aviation industry as airlines scrambled to review their training programs and policies. The incident had revealed gaps in crew training, supervision, and accountability that exposed every airline to potential liability. Maya Johnson, meanwhile, remained calm and focused throughout the investigation. She provided detailed testimony about each discriminatory act, offered additional evidence from her previous experiences with bias in business settings, and outlined her planned reforms for Phoenix Airways that would prevent similar incidents. Her handling of the crisis demonstrated the leadership skills that had made her successful in venture capital. Rather than seeking revenge, she focused on creating structural changes that would benefit all passengers. Rather than dwelling on personal humiliation, she used the incident to drive industry-wide improvement. As federal agents concluded their initial investigation and began preparing formal charges, Maya prepared to transform her personal experience of discrimination into a catalyst for comprehensive reform across the airline industry. The consequences were just beginning, but the message was already clear. Discrimination has costs, documentation has power, and justice, when properly applied, can reshape entire industries. Maya Johnson didn't wait for the federal investigation to conclude before implementing sweeping changes across Phoenix Airways. Within 48 hours of Flight 847's return to the gate, she had assembled a crisis management team, a reform implementation committee, and a public relations strategy designed to transform corporate failure into industry leadership. The Phoenix Protocol, as Maya named her comprehensive reform package, became the most ambitious anti-discrimination initiative in aviation history. Unlike previous airline diversity efforts that focused primarily on hiring practices and public relations, the Phoenix Protocol restructured every aspect of passenger interaction to eliminate bias at every decision point. The centerpiece was the elimination of visible status indicators from crew interfaces. Previously, flight attendants and gate agents could see passenger spending history, frequent flyer status, upgrade eligibility, and even job titles when accessing passenger records. These data points, while intended to enhance customer service for high-value travelers, had created a two-tiered system where crew members made assumptions about passenger worthiness based on algorithm-generated profiles. Under the new system, crew members would see only essential operational information: names, seat assignments, special dietary requirements, and medical accommodations. Status-based perks would be automated through the aircraft's computer systems rather than requiring crew judgment calls that introduced opportunities for bias. Maya hired Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a former Department of Justice civil rights attorney, to design training programs that went far beyond traditional diversity workshops. The new training used actual incident recordings, including footage from Flight 847, to demonstrate how unconscious bias manifests in real-world service situations. Rather than theoretical discussions about cultural sensitivity, crew members watched themselves and their colleagues making biased decisions in real time. The training was uncomfortable, confrontational, and transformative. Flight attendants who had worked for Phoenix Airways for decades discovered patterns of behavior they had never recognized as discriminatory. The company implemented body cameras for all crew members during passenger interactions, with footage reviewed randomly by independent auditors rather than internal management. This wasn't presented as a punitive measure, but as protection for both crew members and passengers, providing objective documentation when service disputes arose. Customer feedback systems were redesigned to capture not just satisfaction ratings, but specific details about respectful treatment, equitable service, and crew professionalism. Passengers could submit anonymous reports about discrimination they witnessed, even if they weren't personally affected, creating a community accountability system that extended beyond individual complaints. Phoenix Airways established a passenger bill of rights that exceeded federal requirements and provided specific protections against discrimination based on appearance, accent, religion, or assumed economic status. The company committed to public reporting of discrimination complaints, investigation outcomes, and corrective actions taken, creating transparency that made bias costly and visible. The Bradford Kane Foundation, funded by the substantial fine he paid to avoid federal prosecution, provided scholarships specifically for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation, hospitality, and transportation. Maya insisted that the foundation be named after Bradford not to humiliate him, but to ensure that his discriminatory actions would be remembered as the catalyst for positive change. Industry response was swift and dramatic. Competing airlines, facing public pressure and potential federal scrutiny, began implementing similar reforms voluntarily rather than waiting for regulatory mandates. Delta Airlines announced new bias training programs within a week. United Airlines revealed plans for crew camera systems. American Airlines hired diversity consultants to review their passenger service procedures. The Transportation Department, responding to public interest generated by the Flight 847 incident, announced comprehensive reviews of discrimination complaint procedures across all airlines. Previously, bias complaints had been handled inconsistently and often dismissed unless they involved obvious violations. The new procedures required detailed investigation and public reporting of all discrimination allegations. Labor unions representing flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew initially resisted some reforms, particularly body cameras and expanded accountability measures. However, union leadership recognized that the Flight 847 incident had fundamentally changed public expectations about airline accountability. The Association of Flight Attendants issued a statement supporting comprehensive anti-discrimination training while emphasizing that most crew members strove to treat all passengers respectfully. The union worked with airlines to ensure that new accountability measures included support for crew members who reported discrimination by colleagues or passengers. Consumer advocacy groups praised the Phoenix Protocol as a model for corporate accountability. The NAACP Travel and Tourism Initiative used Phoenix Airways as an example of how discrimination lawsuits could drive meaningful reform rather than just financial settlements. International aviation authorities took notice as well. The European Union's Transportation Commission invited Maya to present the Phoenix Protocol at a conference on airline passenger rights. Airlines in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom began adapting elements of her reform program to address discrimination complaints in their own markets. The financial impact surprised industry analysts who had predicted that emphasizing anti-discrimination measures would reduce profitability by alienating high-spending customers who expected preferential treatment. Instead, Phoenix Airways experienced increased bookings from passengers who appreciated the commitment to equal treatment. Customer satisfaction scores improved across all demographic groups, including wealthy passengers who discovered that respectful service for everyone created a more pleasant travel environment overall. The airline's employee satisfaction ratings increased as crew members reported feeling proud to work for a company that took ethical leadership seriously. Maya established partnerships with civil rights organizations to provide ongoing oversight of reform implementation. The NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, and the National Council of La Raza appointed representatives to Phoenix Airways' Passenger Rights Oversight Committee, ensuring that external voices could influence policy development. The company created a whistleblower protection program that encouraged employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. Reports could be submitted anonymously through multiple channels, and investigation outcomes were shared with relevant civil rights organizations to ensure transparency. Training programs expanded beyond crew members to include ground staff, security personnel, and customer service representatives. Everyone who interacted with passengers received education about unconscious bias, cultural competency, and conflict de-escalation that prioritized dignity and respect. Maya implemented supply chain diversity requirements, ensuring that Phoenix Airways business partnerships reflected the company's commitment to equality. Vendors, contractors, and service providers were evaluated not just on cost and quality, but on their own diversity practices and anti-discrimination policies. The aviation industry's transformation accelerated as other incidents gained public attention. Passengers began recording service interactions routinely, creating continuous documentation of airline behavior. Discriminatory treatment that previously might have been ignored or dismissed became front-page news when properly documented and shared. Social media platforms developed algorithms to identify and amplify reports of discrimination in travel, creating additional pressure for industry accountability. Airlines discovered that bias incidents could generate negative publicity that lasted for months and affected booking decisions by thousands of potential customers. Pilot training programs added components about crew bias and passenger rights. Aviation schools began teaching future pilots about their responsibility to ensure equitable treatment for all passengers, not just to support crew decisions automatically. Federal regulations evolved to reflect lessons learned from the Flight 847 investigation. The Department of Transportation published new guidelines requiring airlines to document and report discrimination complaints comprehensively. Penalties for discriminatory treatment were increased significantly, and repeat violations could result in loss of operating licenses. Maya's approach proved that accountability could be profitable. Phoenix Airways' stock price recovered and exceeded pre-incident levels as investors recognized that ethical leadership reduced legal liability and enhanced brand value. Other industries began studying the Phoenix Protocol as a model for addressing discrimination in corporate environments. The company's success attracted top talent from across the aviation industry. Pilots, flight attendants, and executives sought to work for an airline known for its commitment to equality and ethical leadership. Phoenix Airways became the employer of choice for professionals who wanted to be part of positive change. Research institutions began studying the Phoenix Protocol's effectiveness, generating academic papers about the business case for comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. Harvard Business School developed case studies based on Maya's leadership during the crisis and her implementation of structural reforms. Maya herself became a sought-after speaker at business conferences, civil rights gatherings, and aviation industry events. Her message consistently emphasized that fighting discrimination wasn't just morally necessary, but economically beneficial for companies willing to make genuine commitments to change. The broader impact extended beyond aviation into hospitality, retail, and other service industries where customer-facing employees made subjective decisions about service quality. Companies across multiple sectors implemented modified versions of the Phoenix Protocol to address bias in their own operations. Maya's transformation of personal humiliation into industry reform demonstrated the power of strategic thinking combined with moral courage. She had proven that individuals with sufficient resources and determination could force institutional change even in large, established industries resistant to reform. The Flight 847 incident became required reading in business schools, law schools, and civil rights training programs. Students learned how documentation, strategic thinking, and principled leadership could transform isolated incidents of discrimination into catalysts for widespread institutional change. As the reforms took hold across the aviation industry, passengers began reporting improved experiences regardless of their background, appearance, or perceived economic status. The changes initiated by Maya's response to discrimination had created a more respectful and equitable travel environment for millions of people. The Phoenix Protocol's success proved that fighting discrimination could be both morally necessary and financially beneficial, providing a model for other industries and other leaders facing similar challenges. 6 months after Flight 847 became the most famous aircraft in civil rights history, Maya Johnson returned to JFK International Airport. She walked through Terminal 4 wearing the same Yale hoodie, the same faded leggings, and the same beaten Nike sneakers that had triggered Bradford Kane's racist assumptions. The difference was that now, everyone knew exactly who she was. Airport staff nodded respectfully as she passed. TSA agents smiled genuinely rather than subjecting her to additional scrutiny. Gate agents greeted her warmly without checking her status in their computers. The transformation wasn't performative or forced. It reflected genuine cultural change that had spread throughout the aviation industry. Maya approached Gate B7, the same gate where federal agents had boarded Flight 847 to investigate civil rights violations. Today, she was flying the same route to London Heathrow, and she had specifically requested Seat 1A on Phoenix Airways Flight 847, now permanently redesignated as the Maya Johnson Memorial Flight in honor of the incident that had changed aviation forever. The gate area buzzed with quiet recognition as passengers realized they were traveling with the woman whose courage had transformed airline accountability. People approached her respectfully, thanking her for the changes that had made air travel more dignified for everyone. Maria Santos, the marketing executive who had live-streamed the original incident, happened to be on the same flight. She approached Maya with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Johnson, I wanted to thank you. My daughter is 15, and she's been following your story. She says you taught her that standing up for what's right can change the world." Jake Patterson, the tech blogger whose Twitter thread had helped the story go viral, was also traveling to London. He shook Maya's hand firmly. "The documentary about Flight 847 premieres next month. The producers want to donate proceeds to the Bradford Kane Foundation. Your story is inspiring a new generation of activists." As boarding began, Maya noticed the airline's crew. Captain Sarah Williams, an African-American woman who had become Phoenix Airways' chief pilot after the company committed to diverse leadership, personally welcomed Maya aboard. Flight attendant Marcus Rodriguez, one of the new hires recruited specifically for the reformed airline's culture, ensured that every passenger felt valued and respected. Maya walked down the jet bridge, her footsteps heavy with memory. She remembered being dragged down this same walkway by airport security while Bradford Kane cheered and Carmen Valdez justified discrimination with corporate language. Today, she walked as the owner who had transformed that humiliation into industry-wide reform. The aircraft cabin had been redesigned to reflect the Phoenix Protocol's values. Gone were the status symbols and preferential treatment indicators that had created artificial hierarchies among passengers. Every seat represented dignity, every passenger received respectful service, and crew members were trained to see human worth rather than spending power. Maya settled into Seat 1A, the same seat Bradford Kane had demanded and Carmen Valdez had tried to deny her. The leather was soft and welcoming, but more importantly, it represented vindication not just for her personally, but for every passenger who had ever been judged unworthy based on their appearance. Seat 1B remained permanently empty, marked with a small plaque that read, "Reserved for dignity, in memory of all passengers denied respect." Maya had insisted on the empty seat as a reminder that the fight for equality required constant vigilance and continued sacrifice. As the plane taxied toward takeoff, Maya reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The 8-year-old girl who had been rejected by a Beverly Hills restaurant had grown into a woman who owned airlines. The MIT student who had been underestimated by venture capitalists now controlled billions in assets. The passenger who had been discriminated against had become the reformer who had changed an entire industry. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, carrying Maya toward London and toward whatever challenges awaited her there. But more importantly, it carried the legacy of Flight 847, proof that individual courage, when properly documented and strategically applied, could reshape institutions and protect future generations from the discrimination she had experienced. Bradford Kane's current circumstances served as a sobering reminder of discrimination's true costs. He lived now in a modest apartment in Queens, working as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company that was unaware of his history. His former wealth had evaporated through legal settlements, canceled contracts, and business relationships destroyed by his documented racism. Kane properties had been sold to pay debts and legal fees. His country club memberships were gone. His social circle had vanished. His children maintained minimal contact, and his grandchildren would grow up learning their grandfather's name as a cautionary tale about the consequences of hatred. Bradford had been required to complete 200 hours of community service working with civil rights organizations. The experience had begun as court-mandated humiliation, but had gradually evolved into something resembling genuine understanding. He worked now with teenagers from backgrounds similar to Maya's, helping them prepare for college interviews and job applications. His transformation wasn't complete or guaranteed. Racism that deep doesn't disappear overnight. But Bradford Kane's fall from privilege to accountability had stripped away the insulation that had allowed his bigotry to flourish unchallenged. For the first time in his life, he faced direct consequences for treating others as inferior. Carmen Valdez had struggled more than anyone to rebuild her life after Flight 847. Her aviation career was over permanently. Her certification revoked, and her actions had been used in training programs across the industry as an example of how not to treat passengers. Single mothers with limited resources don't easily recover from career-ending mistakes that attract international attention. She worked now at a community center in Queens, helping other immigrants navigate social services and job training programs. The work paid barely above minimum wage, but it provided Carmen with opportunities to use her bilingual skills, helping people who faced some of the same challenges she had experienced as a young immigrant. Carmen's children, now teenagers, had been deeply affected by their mother's public disgrace and financial struggles. But they had also learned powerful lessons about the importance of treating everyone with respect and the long-term consequences of moral compromises made for short-term gain. Maya established a scholarship fund specifically for Carmen's children, not as forgiveness, but as recognition that children shouldn't be permanently punished for their parents' mistakes. The scholarships came with mentorship programs designed to ensure the next generation learned different values about dignity and respect. Officer Mitchell had used the incident as a catalyst for positive change in his own career. He became an advocate for enhanced bias training in law enforcement and worked with civil rights organizations to develop better protocols for handling discrimination complaints. His body camera footage from Flight 847 was now used in police academies to demonstrate the importance of thorough investigation rather than automatic support for complainants. Captain Brooks returned to flying after completing enhanced training in crew management and passenger rights. He became a vocal advocate for pilot education about unconscious bias and the importance of personally verifying crew allegations before supporting enforcement actions. His experience reminded aviation professionals that technical competence wasn't sufficient without ethical leadership. The broader impact of Flight 847 continued expanding 6 months after the incident. Other industries had begun adopting modified versions of the Phoenix Protocol to address discrimination in their own operations. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores, and financial institutions implemented accountability measures inspired by Maya's reforms. Civil rights organizations reported increased confidence from community members who had been afraid to report discrimination because they assumed nothing would change. The Flight 847 precedent demonstrated that documented bias could lead to meaningful consequences and structural reform rather than empty apologies and continued discrimination. Law schools began teaching the case as an example of how individual courage combined with strategic thinking could drive institutional change more effectively than traditional litigation alone. Students learned that reform required not just legal victories, but cultural transformation that made discrimination costly and visible. Business schools analyzed Maya's leadership during the crisis as a masterclass in turning adversity into competitive advantage. Her approach proved that ethical leadership could be profitable, that accountability could enhance rather than undermine organizational performance. The international attention had elevated Maya's profile as a thought leader on civil rights, corporate responsibility, and ethical business practices. Universities invited her to speak about transformational leadership. World Economic Forum panels featured her insights on building inclusive organizations. Her influence extended far beyond aviation into global conversations about equity and justice. Maya used her platform to highlight other instances of discrimination and to support activists working for change in different industries. She funded research into bias training effectiveness, supported legal challenges to discriminatory practices, and mentored other business leaders committed to creating more equitable organizations. The Flight 847 incident had become a cultural touchstone referenced in movies, television shows, and books about civil rights progress. Children learned about Maya Johnson alongside historical figures who had fought discrimination in previous generations, understanding that the struggle for equality continued in contemporary forms, requiring modern solutions. As Maya's flight approached London, she opened her laptop to review the agenda for her meeting with European transportation officials who wanted to implement Phoenix Protocol reforms across the European Union. The conversation that had begun with her personal humiliation had become an international movement for aviation accountability. She scrolled through messages from passengers who had sent thank-you notes describing improved travel experiences since the reforms were implemented. Parents wrote about children who felt welcome in spaces that had previously seemed exclusionary. Business travelers from diverse backgrounds reported feeling respected, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. Maya smiled as she read a message from a young black woman who had just completed pilot training and been hired by Phoenix Airways. "Ms. Johnson," the message read, "I wanted to thank you for making it possible for people like us to dream of flying planes, instead of just hoping to sit in them with dignity." The message captured everything Maya had worked to accomplish. The little girl who had been told she didn't belong in a Beverly Hills restaurant had grown up to ensure that no child would face similar rejection simply because of how they looked or where they came from. As Flight 847 began its descent into Heathrow Airport, Maya reflected on the strange turns life could take. A racist passenger and a biased flight attendant had intended to humiliate her and force her from the aircraft. Instead, their discrimination had provided her with the documentation and motivation needed to transform an entire industry. Bradford Kane had wanted her to know her place. Carmen Valdez had assumed her place was in the back of the plane. Both had been wrong about Maya's place in the world, but they had been right about one thing. She was different from other passengers. She was different because she had the resources to fight back, the intelligence to document everything, and the courage to transform personal injustice into institutional change. She was different because she understood that individual success meant nothing without collective progress, that breaking barriers required keeping the doors open for others to follow. Maya Johnson had not just reclaimed her seat in first class. She had redesigned what first-class dignity looked like for everyone who would fly after her. Her legacy wasn't revenge against those who had wronged her. It was reform that protected future generations from experiencing the discrimination she had overcome. As the wheels touched down at Heathrow, Maya prepared for whatever new challenges awaited her in London, but she traveled now with the confidence that came from proving discrimination could be defeated, that justice could be achieved, and that one person's courage could indeed change the world. The little girl who had cried herself to sleep after being rejected by a restaurant had become the woman who ensured no child would face that humiliation alone or without recourse. Maya Johnson had found her place in the world, and she had made that world more just for everyone. Before I wrap up this incredible story of courage and transformation, I want to ask you something important. If Maya Johnson's journey moved you, if her quiet strength in the face of discrimination inspired you, then this message needs to reach more people. Hit that like button right now to help the algorithm share this story with others who need to hear it. And if you believe that dignity shouldn't depend on your appearance or your bank account, if you think every person deserves respect regardless of the color of their skin, then subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell. We share stories like this because they remind us that one person's courage can change entire industries and protect future generations. Share this video with your friends, your family, your co-workers. Post it on your social media. Because the more people who understand how discrimination really works and how it can be defeated, the better our world becomes. Maya Johnson proved that when we document injustice and stand up with quiet strength, we can transform not just our own lives, but the lives of millions of people who come after us. Your engagement with this video isn't just about numbers. It's about spreading a message that discrimination has consequences, that courage has power, and that justice, when properly applied, can reshape the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right, even when the whole world seems to be telling you to sit down.